Thank you.
It's working.
Yeah, we see the red button. Sweet. Thanks, everybody. It continues to be a team effort. So Kim, we're about 3 minutes in. I think we are good to get started.
Great. Okay. So we wanted to start by recognizing several ideas and important topics. And so we are going to start with two different acknowledgements today. The first acknowledgement is for the land that each of us stands on. In a little more than the first 100 years of US history, the United States government has stolen 1.5 billion acres of land from Indigenous people. As this is a virtual conference, participants are from a wide swath of land within the United States. We wanted to recognize with this acknowledgement then a more general acknowledgement to encompass all of the spaces that we are each coming from. And so we would like to respectfully acknowledge the many Indigenous people and groups who have stewarded and continue to steward their ancestral lands throughout the generations. We pay respect to the elders past and present. And finally, we hope that you will take a moment to consider the many legacies of violence, displacement, migration, and settlement that bring us here today. So that is our first acknowledgement. Our second acknowledgement is for those of you who have been affected by COVID. So to those who have lost loved ones, who have been ill themselves, who are frontline workers, okay? To those who have had your lives turned upside down during this global pandemic, we acknowledge you, your emotions, and your realities, and we thank you for spending time with us today. And I will hand the next one to Tori.
Thank you, Kim. As Kim mentioned, we're presenting from Kentucky, but know we have folks all over the country joining us. And so we wanted to situate ourselves a little bit of what is the context of racism in Kentucky and higher ed specifically. So what I'm sharing with you is from the Council on Post-Secondary Education in Kentucky. And we've got a few key dates that will stand out. In 1982, the Commonwealth of Kentucky Higher Education Desegregation Plan was first developed in response to a US Department of Education's Office for Civil Rights finding that Kentucky had, quote, failed to eliminate the vestiges of its former de jure racially dual system of public higher education. For the next 25 plus years, the Council on Post-Secondary Education focused the desegregation plan and subsequent revisions on increasing the enrollment and success of African-American students, increasing the number of African-American employees on campus, and enhancing HBCU Kentucky State University, with later revisions also focusing on improving campus climate. To provide oversight on plan implementation and prioritize diversity initiatives, the Council on Post-Secondary Education created the Committee on Equal Opportunities. In December of 2008, the Office for Civil Rights released Kentucky from the remedial planning process, but the Council on Post-Secondary Education continued its efforts to promote equity and close achievement gaps. A new diversity policy was adopted on September 23rd, 2016, called the Kentucky Public Post-Secondary Education Policy for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion.
So we're going to break our discussion into several acts. The first is on identity. In order for connection to happen, we have to allow ourselves to be really seen. Brene Brown. So I am going to tell you a little bit about who I am, and then I will turn it over to Tori to tell you who she is. I am a straight white woman who is educated. I do have my PhD. I am married, I am the mother of 4 children, and I was raised Catholic. That all creates a person and identities at intersections that are very privileged. One of the spaces that I do like to acknowledge, though, is that we also are very rural. We live in a very rural space on 200 acres of land. And so that's a little bit about who I am. Tori?
Thanks, Kim. I am a single 33-year-old left-leaning first-generation college student who is educated, middle class, cisgender and heterosexual, white, and a Christian feminist woman in America, and all of the intersecting forms of privilege and oppression that occur there.
What we'd like you to do at this moment, and please feel free to use the chat, is to pause and look at this social identity wheel that is from LSA, and we do have it linked in the resources for this presentation. But take a moment to think about the identities that you have and where they intersect in your life most commonly. So we're going to give you about 30 seconds to just look at this wheel. If you feel comfortable sharing in the chat, we are happy to have you share in the chat your identities, but the questions as well as you think about this. So we're going to just be quiet for a moment and let you think. So we are going to move on to Act 2, which is our schooling experiences. And before we do that, I do want to note that Tori and I are in the beginning processes of this autoethnographic work, and that we realize that right now we're in the narrative phase. So we would love to hear your suggestions as we continue through on how to continue the critique that we will get to at the end. But we are going to share our stories as openly and honestly as possible. And we're going to start with how we were schooled. So this is Marcel Proust. The real voyage of discovery consists not in seeking landscapes, but in having new eyes. So I am going to start the conversation by talking about my background. I was a science teacher for a number of years, and after having 4 children, recognized that a teacher's salary was not enough to support daycare. So I went back to school for my PhD, which I received from Miami University in 2012. I will wholeheartedly admit that I was late to the social justice movement. I read Paulo Freire's Pedagogy of the Oppressed probably 4 times before it clicked in my head. And I think that has to do a lot with the spaces that we live in and the spaces that we grew up in, and not recognizing my own privilege. The experience at Miami University, which is still considered amazingly one of the most radical graduate programs in the country, allowed me to explore this. And through that work, my dissertation allowed me to explore the ideas of standpoint feminism and eco-justice. And I think that that learning, that growth was important in not just who I am today, but also the ways in which I now place value on my actions. So I'm gonna pause there and I'm going to let Tori.
Thank you. So I would say, despite having a not racist social justice orientation for most of my adult life, I studied sociology in undergrad and spent time with close friends talking about critical theory and systems of oppression. And I went on to get a master's in nonprofit management. And I had a variety of diverse life experiences and personal relationships. My anti-racist training didn't begin in earnest until 2018 in my doctoral program. And until then, I hadn't realized how homogenous my life had become in between those degrees. So I was lucky to join the program at a time of many changes. And my classmates and I had a wonderful mentor in our interim director, who from the beginning said, no matter what we're talking about, I'll be talking about how it affects Black and Brown students. So I had 3 formal classes with this educator, and I learned much more from her informally as well. And in my first class, I didn't quite get it. I didn't quite understand why we were talking so much about race in understanding the US college student. But it kind of spoke to my sociological interests, and so I went with it, until we came upon the idea of meritocracy, and all of my white fragility showed up. And I could feel myself getting defensive as a first generation college student, but I listened harder and I put my feelings to the side for the time being. My second class with the same instructor didn't trigger those same feelings of personal defensiveness. And I started peeling back those layers slowly. By my third class, I was a sponge for new information. When we read White Fragility, the line that stands out to me most is when Dr. Robin DiAngelo asks a participant what it would be like for them to be able to give feedback to a white person and for them to graciously accept it. And they said that would be absolutely revolutionary. And I think of that often. Its simplicity is heartbreaking, but I also find it inspiring because it's feasible. Even despite all of that, I don't really remember thinking about the term anti-racist for the first time until early 2020 when I was talking to a friend and he said, you know, that's cool, but are you talking about racial justice or anti-racism? And I didn't know.
Thank you, Tori. Again, we're going to take a pause and we would like to ask you some questions. Do you feel that you were educated or schooled around anti-racism and multiculturalism? Why and how? How much did you seek out for yourself versus how much was required of you through works or jobs or classes? How much was normalized in your everyday experiences? So we're going to again take a brief pause and let you think about this. Again, if you want to share, the chat is there for you to do so. I would like to thank the people who are sharing in the chat. Vulnerability is key to some of this work, and so I appreciate those of you who are being vulnerable enough to share. Okay, we're going to move on to Act 3, which for us was our jobs. Maria Leone, we are moving at the speed of liberation is our quote for this section. So we wanted to share how we pay the bills. As I mentioned before, I was a teacher, a science teacher, and I am currently a professor and dean of the College of Education and Health Sciences at Thomas More University. Thomas More University is a Catholic institution, one of only 10 diocesan schools in the country. So that means that the bishop is our chancellor and final decision maker. For a long time as a professor at this space, while it was very different from my other experiences of higher ed in terms of ivory towers and separation between disciplines, I didn't recognize the ways in which I slid into a very racist higher ed identity because I was not paying attention to any of the anti-racist work that I should have been doing, that my eco-justice and feminist standpoint perspective through graduate school had taught me. I did not take the time. It was too easy of a shoe to slip into, to just go and teach my science methods courses, to teach my general methods courses, or to even teach the diversity class in a way that did not engage in anti-racist work. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Tori.
Thanks. So in my full-time job, I'm the Assistant Executive Director at Kentucky Campus Compact, and I also teach several courses at Kim's University as an adjunct. Being a part of the National Campus Compact membership meant that we started talking about race explicitly and combating racism in 2019. At our national meeting, we were given Tima Kuhn's article on white supremacy culture, and that's when I started to understand my defensiveness about meritocracy. When we returned from that national meeting, our office decided to start doing our own internal work, and our first unfacilitated attempts led to me writing a case study about the racial tension in our office that the conversation seemed to have brought out and made worse. Worse because we didn't even know it was there. And we'd been thinking in terms of, are we racist or not? Instead of terms of how does racism show up in our office? I still don't understand all the dynamics of the situation, and people have moved on to new positions now, so I don't know if I ever will. But maybe I don't need to. I can believe someone without having to validate them with my approval, even if it implicates me. So perhaps it's enough to know that I have more work to do and probably always will. I think the problem was ultimately not unique to our office, that access to the structure of the program was held by white people, and through them, any people of color needed to navigate in order to do more than just implement their portion of the program. Our second attempt was to use intergroup dialogue. However, we reached the storming stage of group dynamics and discontinued. Our last charge on the matter was to each take responsibility for our own learning, however that looked.
So at this point, we'd like to ask you to think about what the cost of complicity is when we center our work rather than the people we are engaged with at work, particularly when we're talking about community engagement. What happens at this intersection of class and race? Prior to this conference today, I was having a conversation with a colleague, and you know, we are very privileged people, but we still have conversations about how the work that we're doing, sometimes we are doing it because of the paycheck rather than because of the people that we're trying to help. And in my case, it's kids who want to be teachers. And so working really hard to give them some cultural competency background. But we do want to, again, give a quiet pause to think about the complicity of when we center work rather than other humans. Thank you again to those of you who have posted in the chat. We probably will be calling on some of you at the end during the questions because you have some stories that we would like to hear. We are going to move into our next act, which is 2020. And this is Ernest Hemingway. I like to listen. I have learned a great deal from listening carefully. Most people never listen. So I'm going to say that 2020 both did and did not sneak up on me. My partner works for Miami University, and they were very much on the front lines of thinking about the global pandemic in a much different way than many of our other universities, or at least that was the experience I felt, because he began asking me what we were doing to prepare in November of 2019. Are you thinking about this? Do you have plans for this? And so it hit like a brick, a ton of bricks, but it didn't. Our spring break, I went away with a colleague to just get out of town, and we began planning for our school's COVID plan, not realizing that we wouldn't be coming back after spring break. And so that was, quick turnaround there. And so we kind of hunkered down for the global pandemic, until we started seeing some of the social media posts and the experiences of Black Americans. George Floyd was a moment of reckoning for me, because as I watched some of those videos, I began to realize that as a white American, I had the privilege of looking at it, thinking about it, and turning it off. But this wasn't the first time, right? This is Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, Sandra Bland, Eddie Gray. So this wasn't the first time. This was the 300th time in the short amount of time I've been paying attention. And we can go back further to say the war on drugs in the 80s. That wasn't really a war on drugs. It was a war on Black bodies, especially when you compare it to today's opioid crisis. And so my privilege also said to me, well, what are you going to do about it? And I think that's the piece that we're going to explore here, is what did you want to do about it? But I also am coming to recognize that ability to do something, or to think that I want to do something, is also a privilege of my white body. And so there's been a lot of reckoning between my ability to sit and listen and the things that I can do to make changes, both for myself and for the students that I am teaching, who, as many of you know, are mostly white women going into the teaching field. So again, Thomas More is much different than many of the other institutions of higher ed that I have experienced. And so it was a space where I will continue to say, where else could I have lunch with a philosopher, the physicist, and myself as a teacher educator, and we could have engaging and deep conversations about the structure, theory, all kinds of things. So one of those conversations that began shortly after George Floyd was with our Dean of Students, who is an African-American male, and with our director for the Center of Ethical Leadership and Interdisciplinary Studies. So the three of us got together and we decided that we needed to do something. We weren't quite sure what that something was, but the summer of 2020, what we developed was a series of conversations that we titled Crucial Conversations. And these conversations, we had a long talk about whether or not we were going to include student voice in these conversations. And what we decided, and we explicitly and intentionally decided this, and explicitly and intentionally stated this from the beginning, was that because Thomas More was at the beginning of this work, we needed to make sure that the faculty and staff at Thomas More had a baseline knowledge around these issues, particularly around anti-racism, as while it wasn't new in many higher ed circles, it was new to our space, which is very quiet and very insular. And so we started by giving people homework. People who wanted to participate were asked to do homework prior to each of these conversations. We held them every 3 weeks. We started with Celeste Headley's How to Be a Better Listener and Adichie Chimamande's Danger of a Single Story, both TED Talks that we asked everybody to watch. And we began our conversations. There wasn't a lot of structure to the conversations, but there was the emphasis on the homework and bringing everybody back to the conversation and back to the homework and back to the idea of, okay, this is what this is looking like here. what does it look like here at Thomas More? Where are the places that we're doing good work? Where are the places that we need to continue to do work? And with that, I am going to turn it over to Tori, and bless you to whoever just sneezed.
Oh no, I didn't realize I wasn't on mute. I'm so sorry.
It's okay. It gave us an opportunity to share some blessing in this space.
Thank you.
Kim, there's a good question for some TED Talks if you have any link to the chat of some that you'd recommend or share. So my Act 4 of 2020 was that George Floyd's murder and the resurgence of the Black Lives Matter movement increased the sense of urgency to do something. And personally, I was reading on my own and participating in book clubs and leading some book clubs. And I also joined Kim and her group for Crucial Conversations. At work, it seemed to reveal more potential partners, at least based on press release statements. We joined Anti-Racism Kentucky, for example, to work on education policy initiatives. But we also wanted to convene something, which I now think of as possibly our action bias. Civil dialogue is a hallmark of campus compact work, and we had used living room conversations, which is a simple way to structure social conversations in the past, for example, to convene folks to talk about the pandemic in the early stages. But we knew we weren't equipped to attempt race dialogues by ourselves, so we joined with Ohio and Indiana campus compacts to offer a series of reflective dialogues using living room conversations. Kim participated, and we each served as facilitators in small groups. And I think the small groups served their purpose and went well. They were fairly introductory conversations about our individual racial and ethnic identities. And it's kind of remarkable how quickly folks will open up with new people over video conference. But I do feel that the large group left something to be desired. After the first session, two common themes emerged, which were how to get a more diverse range of perspectives to the conversation, and what are we going to do about it? One idea that came up as a joke at first was BYOWG, bring your own white guy to the next conversation. In session 2 of 3, we used the social change wheel 2.0, which I know we've got Jane on here. Maybe Jane can put it in the links in the chat for everybody, to situate ourselves in reflective dialogue as a form of social change. Around the same time, I guess, facilitated a shortened version of LRC, Living Room Conversations, and the Social Change Wheel 2.0 with Kim's parallel group that I was participating in. But by the second session, we had noticed some attrition from people of color. And as I think back on it now, there were 3 white women hosting the conversation, which I know can be all too familiar for folks that have been involved in this work.
Thank you, Tori. So again, we're going to pause and ask you to think about a couple of things. One of our questions was, did your organization put out a diversity statement this past summer? Okay. Have you seen any changes in your environments, whether they're work or social or on social media, in your own household, post George Floyd? What has already gone back to normal rather than better? How has pandemic fatigue affected the work of activism around, in the case of this audience, anti-racism? But we also want to acknowledge the work of activism that's going around, that's being done around class and gender as well. We're going to move to Act 5 in our reflections. And Act 5 for us is critical reflection. And again, we are still in the process of this work. We have not, we have dipped our toes in, we have not yet plunged in, and we are excited to do so this semester as the semester moves on. But we're going to start with Audre Lorde's, "The true focus of revolutionary change is never merely the oppressive situations that we seek to escape, but that piece of the oppressor which is planted deep within each of us." Thinking about our thinking through this process, there were three things that came to the forefront as I explored my narrative over the course of this last year, basically. And the first is action bias. And I do want to say that this is not my terminology, but it came from a podcast with Brene Brown. And my desire to always want to do something, and the ways in which my desire to want to do something is linked to the white savior knight coming in to save, the other, trope that is out there that we fall into very often. The other thinking about thinking is in the choices that we make, and some of these thinkings are brand new for me. So I am a huge podcast listener. Like I said earlier, I live in rural Indiana on a 200-acre farm, and my drive into work is an hour on a good day. So I listen to a lot of podcasts, and one of the things that I have noticed myself doing is listening to podcasts that share female voices, and hardly ever listen to podcasts that share male voices, particularly Black male voices. So that is, again, a way that I am learning to check myself and start to open up to other possibilities and other choices, so that I am hearing the voices of the other in ways that help me to be in a position of growth. And the final thing that I will share here is identity work. I think one of the, and again, we are in the process of this reflective work and this critical thinking around our identities, but I believe that one of the issues at play is that we as white folks with our privileges don't think about identity work very often. And so I think that step to taking identity work, to thinking about who we are and how we got here, is really important in order for us to be quiet and recognize that our identity is different than others' identities. And with that, I'll turn it over to Tori.
Thanks, Kim. As I'm unlearning white supremacy, I want to acknowledge that a lot of these terms are from Layla Saad's Me and White Supremacy, and that's also referenced in our references and resources at the end. So as I'm unlearning white supremacy, the traps that I have to consistently be mindful of not falling into are, first, white centering. And just as a self-critique of the dialogues was only white female leadership, here we stand presenting as two white women. Second, more broadly, I helped organize this conference having no idea how big it would get. And I've been held accountable for the overrepresentation of white presenters in breakout sessions through critical feedback, which caused me to reflect on mistaking the look of diversity for actual inclusivity and equity, as Layla Saad would say, and whether my explanations inadvertently tokenized BIPOC to prove that my decisions and the decisions of the committee weren't racist. Again, this reminded me of action bias in the entire planning process for the conference, which made me question, has my allyship been more optical than I want to admit? Is holding this conference taking over a space of BIPOC? What were my real motivations for feeling like our group had to create this? And have I stayed present when I'm uncomfortable and it gets hard? I've tried to, and I'm continuing to try to know better so that I can be more mindful and ultimately to do better.
Thank you. So again, this will be our last pause before opening it up for questions. But one of the things that I think that we've recognized through that critical thinking, through that critical reflection, is that we need to do a better job. And as we mean specifically ourselves. So we're not talking to you as we, Tori and I have thought about the role of reflection on our own behaviors and actions, and how do we prioritize that time so that we can find our weak spots, so that we can learn, so that we can figure out where we need to listen better. So again, we're going to pause here for just 30 seconds, and we want you to think about how often you spend time reflecting on your own behaviors and actions, and how do you prioritize that. Okay, we will pause here as a collective, and we would like to, at this point, open it up to questions. So this we thought was a great quote to kind of wrap things up. You will never find time for anything. If you want time, you must make it. And we think that kind of speaks to our own personal next steps, but we are happy to open it up to questions. What might you have to ask of us? And I am going to stop sharing. And Tori, I just want to make sure, I believe this is the case, but I just want to double check that the presentations will be shared, so you will have access to the resources and references that we have at the end of this presentation.
Yeah, we can do that. Kim, if you wouldn't mind keeping screen share up to go to our references and resources.
I can do that.
And we probably have a little over a minute left in here if anybody would like to unmute to pose a question or a reflection. Thank you all so much, particularly people that shared in the chat and trusting us with that. I know we're on our countdown. So hearing no questions, this might be a good time to spend looking back through the chat at some of those comments.
And I think the last thing I will say in these last 22 seconds here is please feel free to reach out to either one of us. We would love to have additional conversation. More than happy to engage long distance, short distance, socially distanced. And thank you for attending.